Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. It's a great that on this summer day we have the full house. And my name is Ivan Krastev. I'm one of the permanent fellows in the Institute for Human Sciences here, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce the speaker tonight, Professor Timothy Snyder. It's going to be a very short introduction because you are not here because you don't know who he is, but because you know who he is. But I just want to make three important points. Timothy Snyder is professor of history in the Yale University in the United States, and I do believe that even his critics are going to agree easily that he is one of the most brilliant and talented historian of his generation. His book Bloodlands was translated to dozens of languages, and I do believe it really provoked a very important intellectual debate. And I have read the manuscript of his new book, Black Curse, which is going to be published this autumn, and here I dare basically to predict that this is going to be one of the intellectual events. We're going to discuss the book in October here in Vienna. What for me is the most important, that he is permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna, so it's even more important than Yale. And his talk tonight is a second of a series of talks which he started on Europe, Russia, Ukraine. And this is quite important because for the last 1 year he was not basically seen only as a historian, but one of the most important voices in the current debate about the crisis of Europe and especially the situation around Ukraine. I'm saying this because I do believe in this role he very much follows one of his friends and mentor, the late historian Tony Judd, who basically was not simply a first-class historian but a great public intellectual. This talk, which he's going to present today, the talk about what's wrong with Hitler-Stalin alliance in the 1939, in my view, is already indicative how much Europe has changed. Because 3 or 4 years, probably this is going to be a strange topic. We knew what was wrong. And for the last 1 year, the last 2 years, in the context of the crisis of Ukraine, certain things that we used to know, probably we don't know anymore. So from this point of view, I do believe this is going to be a very important possibility to talk not only about the history, to talk about the present. Just to give you one example how strongly the present now is, the past is present in our current political reality and crisis. Just a week ago, the European Union announced its prolonging of its sanctions on Russia for the next 6 months. The day it happened, there was an immediate reaction of the Russian Foreign Ministry who said, you did it exactly on June 22nd, the day Nazi Germany attacked Soviet Union. So I'm saying this because, strangely enough, in a certain way, the past is much more present than it was for the last 25, 30 years. And the World War II and the interpretations about the war, what happened, how it happened, is part of the current politics of this crisis. And I believe that one of the best person to start a debate on this, and we're really going to have a discussion after this, is Timothy Snyder, because in his public role, he's playing a position which is very distinctive. There are many people that have been critical to the Russia's position today. What distincts his position, in my view, is a real strong belief in the strengths and basically European future of post-Maidan Ukraine. And I do believe this makes him very unique among the many voices in this debate. So, great pleasure. Tim.
Thank you very much, Ivan. Thanks to the staff at IWM for preparing this. Thanks to all of you for coming on what really is a beautiful day. I mean, if there's anyone here who doesn't have a certain sense of regret about not having a picnic instead of coming here, you're not human as far as I'm concerned. Okay. And it's the human that I want to try to talk about. I want to try to take this issue in as broad a framework as we possibly can, I want to try to take this central historical question of the meaning of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact about as far as it can go, which I believe is very far indeed, into the depths of the 20th century, but also into the depths of where Europe might go if we consider history the wrong way. And by the wrong way, I don't just mean drawing the wrong conclusions, but I mean something like abandoning the possibility to think historically at all. Okay, but before I get to these big claims, let me try to ground them. What I would like to do is divide this lecture into two parts. For about 20 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Russia. And for another 20 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and Europe. In the first part of the lecture, I'm going to ask some questions about what it means for a Russian president to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to ask some questions about what it means when Europeans, well, to put it in a word, don't have any idea what to make of this. But I think as Ivan Krastev has already stressed, we're in a moment where it's not only that history itself is being debated, it's not just that the historical points of reference are changing, it's that what historical debate means is itself changing. And so I think this is a good time to try to see if we can hold on to some of the basic reference points. And so I'm going to organize this talk in a very traditional way around two texts, which I'm sure many of you will know. The first text is a Gulag memoir. It's one of the first and one of the best known memoirs of the Gulag. The English title of this book was A World Apart, and it was written by Gustav Herling-Grudzinski, published in 1951. Herling-Grudzinski was in the Gulag in the very end of 1939 and into the 1940s in Kargopol. And in his memoir, he left us with three thoughts about death, about humanity, and about totalitarianism that I want to introduce to you and then try to return and discuss as points of reference as we move through. Herling-Grudzinski about death writes, now we must remember he's in a camp, he's in a Soviet concentration camp. He writes, "We were united in an egotistical, silent conspiracy of death, and we all accepted the understanding without speaking of it. But we thought with horror that we would become its victims in turn. We recalled moments when, without making the slightest movement, we had watched from under drooping eyelids as dead bodies were being carried out of the barracks at night, and we knew that our own shrieks for help would fail to rouse the others from their defensive apathy." Death. Second quotation about humanity. "I have been convinced that a man could only be human under human conditions." Third quotation about what we call totalitarianism. This is about interrogation inside the Gulag. "A prisoner is considered to have been sufficiently prepared for the final achievement of the signature," that is the moment when the prisoner endorses the protocol of the interrogation, "for the final achievement of the signature only when his personality has been thoroughly dismantled into its component parts." Now, this is a definition or an idea of totalitarianism which does not involve a huge state necessarily. It doesn't involve the state controlling every institution or every individual human being. It involves only the capacity of the state to break down human personalities, to break down human integrity, to break people into, to use the fashionable word of the 21st century, fragments. Now, let me give you a sense of how Herling-Grudzinski got to the Gulag in the first place, because this brings us closer to our subject. In 1939, 1940, Gustav Herling-Grudzinski was a very young Polish writer, and he had the idea that he would cross the border from Poland into Lithuania. His eventual intention was to find a way to fight against the German occupation of his country. Instead, he was captured by the Soviet police at the Polish-Lithuanian border and taken to be interrogated. He was roughly one of 500,000 or so Polish citizens who were arrested for one reason or another by Soviet authorities in 1939 to 1941. At this time, of course, Poland and Lithuania, Eastern Poland and Lithuania, were both under Soviet occupation. During his interrogation, Herling-Grudzinski had an interesting conversation with his interrogators, interesting for us at least. He was charged with the offense of crossing a border illegally in order to fight against Soviet power. So Herling-Grudzinski was prepared to confess to crossing the border, but he asked his interrogators for one small change to the interrogation protocol. He asked them if they could change the phrase to fight Soviet power so that it read instead to fight German power. Now it's their answer which is of interest to us. Their answer was laughter, and then they said, it comes to the same thing. It comes to the same thing. Now, why did it come to the same thing? Because this was 1940. This was the period of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Since September of 1939, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were, in effect, military allies. This was a period when Soviet propaganda was very pro-German. This was a period when the Soviet Union was supplying the German armed forces as they made war against the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, and Great Britain in the Battle of Britain. So this was a period when it was reasonable for Soviet state policemen to say, it comes to the same thing. Now, this is a critical moment for all kinds of reasons. And the first question that I want to ask is, what does it mean for Russia and perhaps for Russia's neighbors if the president of the Russian Federation rehabilitates the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact? This is not a theoretical question. President Putin has not once but twice, in very prominent circumstances, rehabilitated the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. So what are we to make of this? What does this all mean? Let me first try to answer this question by just a brief review, which I'm sure you don't need, of what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact means as history. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was the beginning of the Second World War in Europe as such. If you're an international historian, you'll remind us that the Second World War began earlier in Asia. If you're a historian of Africa, you'll recall Ethiopia's intervention in, Italy's, that was revisionism, Italy's intervention in Ethiopia. But if you're a historian of Europe, you'll recall that the Second World War as such, the Second World War in Europe begins with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the joint German-Soviet offensives that followed. You'll remember, of course, as well, that the way that the Second World War begins is that in the late 1930s, Germany is seeking an ally. Hitler wishes to begin a war, but he does not wish to begin a war by himself. He's looking for an ally. He's turned down at various points by various countries, including Poland. In August of 1939, he finds an ally, that is to say, a country which is willing to begin a war of aggression on the German side. Now, we recall the Second World War in various ways, depending upon where we're from, what we're thinking about. There are various ways of remembering the Second World War. I'm happy to talk about the problems with these ways, including the American one, which is, of course, basically ridiculous. But in historical terms, if we're thinking of Europe, this is the only Second World War that we have. This is the only way that the Second World War actually began. It might have begun in some different way, but as a matter of fact, it began in this way. We can't be sure that it would have begun at all if Hitler hadn't found an ally. I often ask myself what would have happened if the Soviet Union had simply been neutral in 1939 and done nothing. Certainly events would have been quite different. But the interesting element of all of this is that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is not simply a kind of regional event. So if there are Poles and Lithuanians and Latvians and Estonians in the room, you don't have to raise your hand or anything. You will of course think of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a turning point in the history of your countries, because this was the moment when the statehood of the Baltic countries and the statehood of Poland was destroyed. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact it was a kind of curiosity of history in that it was denied by the Soviet Union. Its existence was denied by the Soviet Union, and it was the Baltic states which in 1990 brought it back to public consciousness. But of course, as a matter of memory, that's one thing. As a matter of history, it was always there. And I want to consider what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact meant as a matter of history, because what it means goes far beyond what it meant to Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, and and Poles. I've already stressed that it was the beginning of the Second World War, which is perhaps significance enough, but there are more things to say about it than that. One is that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact set up a peculiar situation inside Poland. It's not just that the Soviet Union occupied one side and Germany occupied the other side. It is also the case that this meant that Soviet policies of terror are extended to eastern Poland. You will all be aware of the Katyn massacre, the murder of 22,000 Polish citizens, most of them reserve officers. You might well be aware that in 1940, the absolute majority of arrests made by the Soviet services in the entire Soviet Union were in eastern Poland, which is a tiny percentage of the whole country. Something similar is probably true about Crimea now. We don't know. But it's also the case that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is the moment when German power became murderous. So between 1933 and 1939, the total result of Nazi terror was something like 2,000 deaths between 1933 and 1939. That is, of course, exceeded in the first day of the war, right? And by the end of 1939, the Germans have killed tens of thousands of civilians, a number which will go into the hundreds of thousands in 1940. In other words, without the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, without the destruction of Poland, without the beginning of a very special kind of war, you don't have Germany becoming a murderous power. And this is important because when we ask the question, for example, how did German terror begin or how did the Holocaust happen, we emphasize the story of 1933, how Hitler came to power, which is of course important. But we might underestimate the significance of 1939, that is, how the war actually began, or that a war began. As a matter of fact, Germany only kills people in large numbers beyond the borders of pre-war Germany, which makes the question of how German power got beyond the borders of pre-war Germany very important. And the first way that it did during a war was with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. But there's something more to be said here, because though, of course, there's a tendency for us to think, and it's a natural tendency, for us to think of German policy as one thing and Soviet policy as another thing. From the point of view of a country like occupied Poland, which was one country, there were relationships between Soviet power and German power. I don't mean to say anything facile like that the Germans and the Soviets were the same kind of regime or they did the exact same things. I'm trying to look at it from the point of view of the populations who were affected. There was an overlap, to put it this way, at the level of families. There was an overlap which has to do with citizenship, which when we think ethnically, as we often do, we might overlook. So for example, I mentioned Katyn. Right? I mentioned the murder of around 22,000 Polish citizens in April of 1940, which was at Katyn and at 4 other sites. The shooting in the back of the head of 22,000 Polish citizens by the NKVD very quickly. So when I said that, you probably thought of 22,000 Poles. But of course, those 22,000 people were not all Poles. Those 22,000 people were evenly represented the populations of the Polish state, which is to say that the percentage of Jews was representative of just for example, of the populations of the Polish state. So for example, just to press the point at the level of families and down to the level of how history actually happens or is experienced, one of the Polish officers who was murdered at Katyn was a Jew called Hieronym Brandwein, whose wife later was killed in the Warsaw Ghetto. Another Jewish Polish officer who was killed at Katyn was a man called Mieczysław Proner, whose mother was later gassed at Treblinka. The point could be extended indefinitely. In the Soviet deportations that took place at around the same time, in which roughly 400,000 Polish citizens were deported, it wasn't just the case that some Jews were deported. The percentage of Jews in these deportations was actually hugely overrepresentative of the percentage of Jews in the Polish population as a whole, which meant that families were being split up in Poland because heads of household and others were being killed or deported right before the time that the Holocaust happens, which means that this is in some sense part of the history of the Holocaust. When one thinks of these families being sent to the Warsaw Ghetto, one must think of them being sent to the Warsaw Ghetto without, for example, the fathers. And this is something to consider because this is the way it was experienced at the time. The way that these Polish families experience these things, these Polish Jewish families experience these things, was not necessarily that there were these abstract policies by these different regimes. These things were experienced at the level of families, and at the level of families, it all gets mixed together. So even to take the example of Gustav Herling-Grudzinski, who, some of you will probably know is one of the greatest Polish writers of the post-war period. Gustav Herling-Grudzinski, who was sentenced to the Gulag and spent the war chopping down trees in frozen tundra, he was also himself Jewish. And he had a brother called Mieczysław, who was Jewish, who played a very interesting role saving fellow Jews of Warsaw during the Second World War. Just another way of saying how these histories come together, and how the beginning of the Second World War is also the beginning of the social experiences of the Second World War, of which, of course, the darkest is no doubt the Holocaust. But there's something else to say now from the point of view of, let's say, less anthropology, which I've just been spending a few minutes with, and more from the perceptive of, let's call it, political science. Staying with the topic of the Holocaust, but thinking about it in a slightly different way. We know some interesting things about the Holocaust now that we didn't know a few years ago, thanks to the extension of historiography in general into Eastern Europe, thanks to a number of wonderful monographs, many of which have come out of this city and elsewhere in Central Europe. One of the things that we know, which we didn't know, let's say, 10 years ago, is the percentage of Jews that died in various places. And so one of the things that we know, which we perhaps weren't so clear on before, is how the Holocaust, where the Holocaust started, how and under what circumstances, and then who died in the greatest numbers. So it is interesting, and I think actually not at all coincidental, that the Holocaust started in this zone, this Molotov-Ribbentrop zone. So in the very places where the Soviets conquered and annexed territory, Eastern Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, those are the first places then touched by German power again in 1941. And it's in these places where the Holocaust actually starts. Now again, as with any other counterfactual, you could say it might have started some other way, but this is in fact how, when, and where it did start. And this zone, and again I think this is not a coincidence, this zone, this Molotov-Ribbentrop zone, where first Soviet organs were installed and then the Germans removed them in 1941, is the place where it was most risky to be a Jew in all of Europe over the course of the Holocaust. Your chances of surviving if you were in this zone were about 97, were about 3%. Your chances of dying were about 97%. Which leads us into a question, which I think is a very fundamental question as we start to move slowly from history to memory, which is the question of the actual course of the Holocaust and what this has to do with the history of the Soviet Union. Now, you might already find yourself resisting that sentence that I just uttered, the history of the Holocaust and the history of the Soviet Union, because so much of the way that we have been instructed to think about the Holocaust is to think about the Soviet Union as anti-fascist, as rebuffing the Germans, as resisting, all of which is true in a certain way much later. But when we actually follow the course of the Holocaust, how it proceeds, of course, the way it proceeds is that it begins in these zones where Soviet power and German power are both present, and then after that, it follows German power eastward into the Soviet Union. And this is the only place where the Holocaust is happening, mind you, in 1941. It's not happening in Austria, it's not happening in Germany, it's not happening in Poland, in the parts of Poland that Germany occupied in 1939. It is happening in the Soviet Union in 1941. This is where it begins, this is where it spreads. And it gets, so to speak, worse, because as you will all now know, because this is one of the main things that historians have made clear in the last 15 years or so, as you will all now know, about half of the Holocaust takes place not in gas chambers, but in the open air over death pits. And this is the version of the Holocaust which happens in the occupied Soviet Union, which has the following logical consequence. If you carry out the Holocaust by mass shooting, this means that you have lots and lots of local collaborators. If you carry out the Holocaust by gassing, you have relatively few. But if you carry it out by mass shooting, you have lots and lots of local collaborators in the Soviet Union in the low hundreds of thousands. So the one thing that the huge majority of direct collaborators in the Holocaust have in common is the Soviet passport. right? I don't mean people who took part in the Holocaust or who benefited from it. I mean direct collaborators, people who actually held the gun and shot someone or murdered someone in one way or another. The huge majority of these people had Soviet passports. Now again, you might be feeling some internal resistance to this proposition, but it is empirically indisputable. The Holocaust began here and extended here. And one of the reasons, I'm just going to signal this point early because we're going to come back to it. One of the reasons you might be resisting this is you might be saying, well, wait, wasn't it the Lithuanians or the Latvians or the Estonians? Or you might be saying, wasn't it the Ukrainians or the Belarusians or the Russians? Or wasn't it the ethnic Germans? And that would be true. It was all of those people. But the thing they had in common was the Soviet passport. That's the thing that the huge majority of direct collaborators in the Holocaust had in common. And you will then now anticipate the point that I'm about to make. It made no difference where in the Soviet Union you were. As a Jew, your chance of dying was essentially the same, whether it was Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Ukraine, Belarus, or Russia itself. All that mattered was the presence of German power. Wherever German power extended, the Holocaust also extended and local collaborators were found. In later polemics, which are so dear to us because we think ethnically, most of us, although if we're enlightened, we tend to deny it, in later polemics, it's very important to say it was the Ukrainians or the Russians or the Latvians or the Estonians or the ethnic Germans or the Tatars. And indeed, it was all of those people, but it was all of those people. It was all of those people. So when German power crosses a Soviet boundary, say between Ukraine or Belarus, or Ukraine and Russia, or Belarus and Russia, the Germans pay no attention, and they're right not to pay any attention because it makes no difference in terms of the behavior of the local populations. There is no border of virtue where people start behaving differently. So to take the example of Russia, by the time, and this is a telling example, by the time that German power reaches Smolensk, it's been a while because the Battle of Smolensk goes on for months. By the time the Germans reach Smolensk, most of the Jews have already left, which creates the following situation. The local Russian leadership in Smolensk realizes that when Jews leave, that creates open apartments for Russians and others to move into. And they immediately come to the conclusion that if the rest of the Jews were also to leave, that would open up even more apartments. And so when the Germans arrive, that is the proposition that they make to the Germans. And the Germans, of course, have a way of making sure that the rest of the Jews no longer are there, right? And then you have the mass murder of the Jews carried out as it is in all of the Soviet lands, that is with German leadership, but with a good deal of local participation, by which I mean direct participation. It's the same story all over Russia, everywhere that German power reaches. It gets, for example, Kaluga, which is only about 200 kilometers southwest of Russia. The Germans are only present there for 2 months, but that's long enough to expel the Jews from their houses, set in apartments, set up a ghetto, kill most of them. It's long enough for the local Russian population to move into the apartments, and then to rebuff the Jews when the Germans are driven out in December of 1941. So this is true all over the zone of Russia that the Germans occupy. It's true in Bryansk, in Kursk, Pskov, in places beyond Russia, in Vilnius, Riga, Minsk. Russians serve also the Germans in Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. In the death facilities, Russians are among the guards. Something like 400,000 Russians fight on the German side of the Second World War as collaborators. The point here, though, is not that the Russians behave any worse than anyone else in the Soviet Union. The point is that they behave exactly the same as everyone else in the Soviet Union. Ethnicity makes no difference whatsoever. And this is not a moral point. Perhaps we would like it to be. It is an empirical point. The behavior of Soviet populations is everywhere exactly the same. Which brings me to the question of memory, finally. What does it mean, then, to revive the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as a positive example of diplomatic history? What does it mean, to make the question slightly more complicated, more interesting, to simultaneously say the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a good thing. So beginning the Second World War was a good thing. Being a German ally was a good thing. What does it mean to do that? And simultaneously to say, to celebrate the end of the Second World War as a great national anniversary, right? This is where things start to get slightly interesting. Because, okay, let's accept that it was a good thing to be a German ally in 1939, then how exactly do we get to the point where it was a good thing to be the power that defeated the Germans in 1945? How does one keep both of those positions in mind at the same time, right? Because to endorse the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is to endorse an alliance with Germany. To celebrate the anniversary of May 9th is to celebrate a victory over Nazi Germany. All right, that's fine. We all have our little contradictory problems in personal life, but in high politics, it seems like there's something here which is worth pausing to consider, especially when you consider that President Putin's two rehabilitations of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, one came not long before and one came not long after May 9th. So I assume that he had all of these things in mind at the same time. We're going to celebrate the victory over the Germans, and we're going to celebrate being allies of the Germans. How does this actually work out? I'm going to suggest something to you. It's a little speculative, and we can talk about it later, but I think I have a sense of how this actually works. And the way to explain how it works begins with the Soviet past. So those of you who have worked on Soviet history, who have experienced Soviet history, who have thought about these things, will know that there was a very traditional strategy in the Soviet Union for dealing with the problem of collaboration with Nazi Germany, whether with collaboration in the Holocaust or collaboration in general. There was a traditional strategy, which has had a huge effect on the way we think about the war, I think. The traditional strategy was a strategy of what I would call the export of responsibility. So when forced to discuss collaboration of Soviet citizens in the Second World War, collaboration of Soviet citizens in the Holocaust, the typical Soviet move from Khrushchev onwards was to say, yes, there were Lithuanians who did that, there were Latvians who did that, there were Estonians who did that, and there were Ukrainians who did that. In other words, to push the responsibility westward and to ethnicize the responsibility. The Soviet citizenship as such had to be sound, but you could export the responsibility onto particular ethnic groups. And then there was another general move of exporting responsibility, which was to talk about something called fascism. Okay, now the word fascism appears so much now in our everyday discussions that it's very hard to attach any meaning to the word fascism, but it did have something like a meaning, and the meaning was this. Fascism was supposed to be the last stage of capitalism. So fascism was something which came from the decadent capitalist West. Soviet collaborators were fascists. They were somehow infected by fascism. What this meant was that in a general way, in a structural way, in a theoretical way, all collaboration was the fault of the West. It was the fault of the capitalist West. So this was another way of exporting responsibility. If you talk about fascism, as the Soviets did, as a kind of phenomenon which arose from capitalism, then anything which fascism brought could not be, by definition, have anything to do with the Soviet Union as such. It had to come from outside. So this is another way of exporting responsibility. The idea of a great fatherland war, of a war in which the Soviet population undoes all evil and defeats fascism, the idea of the great fatherland war that we have now picks up speed about a quarter century after the end of the war itself and becomes a kind of second founding myth of the Soviet Union in the 1970s. I just stress that to note that all of the way that people think about the war doesn't necessarily directly arise from the war itself. Soviet experience was very concrete. The myth is much more abstract, and the myths of today are even more abstract. The interesting thing about the myths of today, I think, is that they take this trend and they push it to a higher level. The idea that for example, the western part of the Soviet Union is where all the fascists were, is an idea which appears again today. But now it's not just some Ukrainians who are fascists and collaborators, it's the nation itself is fascist, right? The Ukrainian nation itself is somehow presumably fascist. So the guilt is ethnicized, but in a much more general and in a much more in a way powerful fashion. The Great Fatherland War returns and is very much present as a myth, but interestingly now it's used in a way which it was, I don't think, maybe someone will correct me, used before. It's used to justify an aggressive war. right? Because the Great Fatherland War, whatever you think about it, it was a war of defense. It was a response to the German invasion of 1941. In 2014 and in 2015, the Great Fatherland War is being used as a justification for a war of aggression, for sending Russian troops across the Russian border unprovoked onto Ukrainian territory. So this, I think, helps us, moves us a step closer to understanding at least how this problem is dealt with. I mean, to put it in the sharpest possible way, what does it mean to be in favor of starting the war, and also in favor of ending it? And what does it mean to be pro-fascist and anti-fascist at the same time? I think what it means is that you have, among other things, you have a kind of contradiction to deal with. And what I want to try to suggest now, as we move into the second part of the talk, is that whereas what the Soviet Union did, to great effect, was export responsibility to ethnicities, export responsibility to the West as a general concept. Russia is continuing this trend, but it's also doing something else which is more interesting and perhaps more dangerous. It is also exporting its own contradictions. This logical problem that Russia's for war, against war, it's for fascism, it's against fascism, it started the war, it ended the war. This is not a problem that they're going to solve for us. This is not a problem that Russians are going to solve. It's a problem that has been created inside Russia and I think has been floated out as some kind of giant psychological trial balloon over the West. And now we're going to see how well we will respond. So this brings me to the second question. What does it mean for Europe to have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact rehabilitated? Why might it not be such a good thing for Europe, or if you like, for the West, for the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact to be rehabilitated? By which I mean, why is it perhaps not a good thing if the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is rehabilitated and we don't know what to say about it? Which I've been struck we generally don't. Now, to get our mind around this, I'm going to introduce a second text, which, like the first one, might be familiar to many of you. It's a very famous poem by Yeats, The Second Coming, from 1919. Let me read you the most famous paragraph. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon can no longer hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. I'm not going to push that upon you as a description of European public debate in 2015, but I'm going to suggest that it might not be entirely misplaced, and I'm going to try to develop an argument as to why that might be. This argument has to do with the particular ways that rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact actually touches on shared European history, how it's not just a matter of what a Russian president says to Russians about how Russians should think about themselves, how it's not just a matter of loosing this general contradiction over the Western world and seeing how we respond, but more specifically how the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact brings with it certain historical points of contact which we may or may not have even noticed. Okay, let me try to be more specific. One of these, and it's fairly obvious to me, and I think it was fairly obvious to a lot of Russians, and it was certainly obvious to a lot of Ukrainians and Poles. One of these is the way that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was justified in 1939 in Soviet propaganda as compared to the way that the invasion of Ukraine was justified in Russian propaganda in 2014. In both cases, 2015 as well, in both cases, one of the central arguments was state failure. When the Soviet Union invaded Poland in September 1939, the claim was made that the Polish state has failed. Now, any of you who have followed the Russian invasion of Ukraine realize that this was not only the claim which was made as Russian troops entered Ukraine a year and 2 months ago, but it's also the claim which is repeated regularly, that Ukraine is not a real state, that Ukraine is a failed state. Failed state might sound like some kind of newfangled term, but in fact it is exactly what the Soviet Union said in 1939. Now, more broadly, this business of states failing, or more precisely, of making states fail. I mean, one of the ways to make a state fail is to talk about how it is a failure, right? I mean, but this business of making states fail and talking about how states don't exist or are not justified or are composite, is actually part of a larger European history, which we tend to forget, or we might forget if President Putin didn't remind us of it. And that is the larger period between 1938 and 1941. This is a period of which the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is a part, a central part perhaps, but not the only part. It's the period of the destruction of the pre-war European order, step by step, as European states are destroyed. So of course, this country, Austria, by Anschluss in 1938, Czechoslovakia at Munich, and then by German invasion in 1938 and 1939, Poland, the Baltic states by joint German-Soviet action in 1939 and 1940. So over the course of a relatively short time, 6 European states are completely removed from the map by German and then by joint German and Soviet action. This is an interesting moment, and when I say President Putin doesn't let us forget it, what I mean in particular is his personal obsession, which is also a general trope in the way Russians talk about the 1930s, with Munich. With Munich, with the decision of 4 Western states to allow part of Czechoslovakia to be given to Germany in 1938. And of course, one can agree with his criticism of Munich, but the interesting part of this is that the tactics of Munich and even the language of Munich has been picked up by Russian foreign policy. The idea of Sudetenland, right? Does Sudetenland sound like a real place to you? The term Sudetenland was invented for the purposes of Munich. There was no such thing as Sudetenland. If you look at maps before the late 1930s, yes, there was no such place. Sudetenland was invented for the purposes of taking Czechoslovakia apart. Just like Novorossiya, although it does have a historical meaning, which doesn't coincide with its current one, the idea of Novorossiya is invented for the purposes of dismantling Ukraine, right? The arguments are also the same. The arguments that are used to justify Munich are that there's an ethnic minority / a linguistic minority which it's legitimate to give outside protection to. The same argument which is used in 2013, 2014 with respect to Ukraine. So it seems clear to me that President Putin's obsession with Munich is not just a way of his telling all of us that our history isn't pure, which is frankly not a surprise. It's also, I think, a guide to some of the tactics which they have drawn from this larger period of state destruction. Now, the other thing which is interesting about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or Munich if you prefer, in general, this Russian return to 1939, 1938, with respect to Europe, is the way that it is an invitation. That is to say, when you rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, of course, had 2 parties, right? It had the Soviet Union and it had Germany. It had a Western partner and an Eastern partner. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is one of these things that you just can't do by yourself, right? You need someone else. And the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has been accompanied by a concrete invitation, actually 2. The first one was to Poland. The idea was that Poland should take part with Russia in the partition of Ukraine, an idea that even the Poles, who generally have a fairly well-developed geopolitical imagination, had trouble finding the terms to respond to when the letter arrived in the foreign ministry. And the second, of course, is a suggestion, which one can read from President Putin's second rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, that perhaps Germany might have an interest in considering Eastern Europe in terms of spheres of interest, just like in the good old days. So the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is not just a matter for Russia. It is inherently also an invitation to the rest of Europe to think about politics in a particular way. And I would stress that it's not just a particular invitation, although particular invitations have in fact been extended. It's also a general invitation, because the language in which the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is rehabilitated is the language of great power politics as the way things really are. It's an invitation to think about the world, to use a term that I really don't like, geopolitically, that people aren't real, ideals aren't real, the only thing which really societies aren't real, the only thing which actually matters are states and great powers, and there's a natural hierarchy, and there are big countries and there are little countries, and little countries just have to take it because that's just the way the world is. That kind of rhetoric is the rhetoric which surrounds the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and it is of course an invitation to Europeans to think about, or at least to Europeans in big countries like Germany, to think about the politics of Europe in a different way. Now, at the same time, the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact has coincided with a very concrete attempt to return Europe to the 1930s, to return Europe to an age of nation states. This isn't just a rhetoric and invitation. There's also something which is going on behind the scenes. And now I'm going to do something which I hope you will forgive me for. I'm going to recall a correct prediction that I made. In May of 2014, in Kiev, giving a lecture, I predicted that Russia would rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And the reason that I made that prediction is none of the stuff that I've been saying so far. The reason I made that prediction was very specific, because already then it was very clear that the Kremlin was entering into serious relationships with the European far right. And that is a way of returning Europe, or helping, as it were, Europe to return to a quote-unquote normal world of great power politics. Because what the far right and the Kremlin have in common is the belief that the European Union is something artificial, something doomed, something decadent, and it would be much better if we return to a quote-unquote normal world of nations. And the relationship with the far right since the time that I talked about it a year ago has been sufficiently documented that I'm sure you are all aware of it. So where does then this bring us? It brings us to a general idea of what the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact means, not only for Europe, your mission should you choose to accept it, not just for Europe, but also in Europe. Because the politics of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact are already underway. They're already playing themselves out in local, regional, and national politics inside the European Union. There is a strategic level of this, and the strategic level is the same as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact itself. From the point of view of Moscow in 1939, align with Hitler, align with the European extreme right, was a way to turn Europeans against Europeans and destroy the European order. The whole strategic thinking, which Stalin was very clear about in conversations with Molotov and Kaganovich and others, was that we will in this way get the Germans to fight the British and the French. This will release the natural contradictions of capitalism, and it will bring down a European order. Cooperation today with the extreme right in Europe has the same logic. We cooperate with the extreme right. Maybe we like it, maybe we don't. I think they like it, but maybe they like it, maybe they don't. But the strategic point is, if you cooperate with the extreme right, these are the people who are against the present European order. They are the ones that we can hope will bring it down. And when they do bring it down, then we'll be in this position that we want to be in this position where only states matter. Now, this business of only states mattering is more serious than it might think. In the United States, we have political scientists who call themselves realists, and what they mean by realism is that they exclude all aspects of reality that one actually encounters, and focus only on a highly stylized view of states. Right? This is the kind of view that we're talking about here. Realism in the sense of state power being the only thing which truly matters in the world. That's the normative view, which is behind all of this. But as I say, it's no small thing to believe something like that. Like if you're sitting in Columbia or Chicago or whatever, and you say stuff like this, honestly, it doesn't matter. But if you really believe this and you make it policy, if you claim that only state power matters, this has implications for those things in the world that are not state power. And just to give you a couple of examples, the things in the world that matter that aren't state power, I mean, it's a very long list, but one of them, of course, is the European Union, right? And another, of course, is civil society. So Russian policy in the last 2 years has been aimed explicitly, notice how little I've talked about Ukraine, because this is not really about Ukraine. Russian policy is aimed explicitly at the European Union. That is a level of international political life, which is not just state power, and it's also aimed explicitly at civil society, right? Aimed at the Maidan, of course, in Ukraine, aimed at non-governmental organizations inside Russia, of course, but also aimed at the idea of civil society as such. As such. It doesn't exist, is the point. The only thing which is real are states. If the only thing which is real are states and morality and personal relations and ethics and traditions and practices and everything else is just a bunch of fluff. If the only thing that really matters is states, then hey, why not a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, right? This is how it all hangs together. Now, the thing about this theory, or the thing about this idea that only states matter, is that like most elegant theories of this kind, it runs up against a certain resistance in practice. So for example, the Maidan, to make a short story short, was in fact real. right? The Maidan, in fact, happened. Some of you were there. You know, it happened. The European Union, as much as we, you know, Americans spent the 1990s making fun of it, and it's been interesting to see all of my Republican friends now like have to change course on the European Union completely because they spent, you know, back in our decadent days of the 1990s, they spent all of their time making fun of it. You know, they're from Venus, blah, 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 blah. They basically invented the whole Russian decadence rhetoric for the Russians, who just had to translate it into Russian and then give it back to us 15 years later. It's been interesting to watch how my Republican friends are now feeling a little bit sorry about all of that and are saying like these very like, European Union, it might be a good place for Ukraine. You know, it's been kind of just a little American moment for you. Okay, But the point here, the point I'm trying to get at is that the theory runs up against some problems in practice because these things, civil society, the European Union, are in fact, you know, let's not debate about this too long. They are in fact real, and the way that Russian propaganda has gotten around this has been, and Russian propaganda is a whole different subject. I just want to stress one aspect of it. The way Russian propaganda has gotten around this has been to hit at these phenomenons in highly aggressive, but interestingly contradictory ways. So for example, the United States and Europe, right, are simultaneously presented as decadent, you know, so pedophilic and so on, and presented as fascist, right? So, I mean, whatever you think about, like, you know, decadence and like all that stuff and fascism and all that stuff, they're not the same thing, actually. They arguably they're quite different. The approach to the Ukrainian state has been rather similar. So, in the propaganda about the Ukrainian state, some Russian propaganda has claimed that the Ukrainian state is a front for the international Jewish conspiracy, and some Russian propaganda has claimed that Ukraine is a country entirely populated by anti-Semitic Nazis. Like, again, you know, whatever you think about those two views as such, right? You have to admit they contradict. They can't both be true. Or it would be a really clever international Jewish conspiracy, which, you know, use the whole country full of anti-Semites to, you know, exert its power in the world. And, you know, there are the more mundane examples of this, right? So that, for example, the Ukrainian language doesn't exist, but Russians are forced to speak it. The Ukrainian state doesn't exist, but it's oppressive, right? The Ukrainian nation doesn't exist, but all Ukrainians are nationalists. If you think about these things for just a second, it's clear that they contradict. And I think, in a way, that's the contradiction which is interesting, because the biggest contradiction, or the most telling contradiction, is the one which is most obvious since we've gotten this far in the lecture, and that is the self-presentation. The biggest contradiction is the pro-fascist anti-fascism, which isn't just a matter of being in favor of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, but also being in favor of defeating Nazi Germany on the battlefield. It's also a matter of being a state which is anti-green, anti-feminist, anti-homosexual, slightly chest-bearing, ethnic, linguistic in its foreign policy. It's partly a matter of what is obviously a rather right-wing state, to put it in a kind of mild way, what is obviously a rather right-wing state calling its enemies fascist. There's a big contradiction here. I mean, it's a problem to have annual marches in Moscow of fascists and then to call your enemies fascists. It's a problem to have congresses of fascists in St. Petersburg and call your enemies fascists. There's a problem here. But as I say, it's not a problem which I expect the Russian leadership to solve. It's a problem which is being punted back out to us. It's a problem which I think is meant to be a problem for Europe. So let me just give you three thoughts in conclusion. Let me try to bring this all together. When I was talking about this, when I made this brief allusion to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact 13 months ago in Kiev, what I was thinking about was a tactic. And I thought what I was saying then was pretty radical, you know, that there was this tactic. They're going to rehabilitate the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. They're going to use the far right. They're going to try to use it to break the West. And I thought that was, you know, I thought that was pretty radical at the time, and other people thought it was pretty radical at the time. And a year later, it doesn't seem radical at all. It seems fairly obvious that that was a tactic. But when the rehabilitation actually came in late 2014, and again a few weeks ago in 2015, it came as a tactic, but also as something more interesting, as a kind of politics. the way that President Putin formulated the rehabilitation was within a larger context of the claim that the politics of the 1930s are the normal kind of politics. The politics of today are abnormal. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is normal. That's the way that things ought to be, right? That's the way that things ought to be. That's normal. Everything else is everything else is superficial. Everything else is inauthentic. The real men know that that's the real world. That's the way that things actually are. And then the third point that I've tried to make about this is that as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is being rehabilitated, it's been part of a much larger package of views about history and the present, which are ineradicably contradictory. The rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact goes together with celebrating the feat of Nazi Germany. The support of the far right goes together with the claim that the enemies are fascists, and this is not going to go away. This is, I think, in some sense, the essence of the issue and the essence of the challenge to us in the West. And now I'm going to, and here comes my conservative moment. You can feel free to leave the room at this point if you want. But it seems like that it's not just that, historically speaking, rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. He came in at the right moment. It's not just that rehabilitating the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is a kind of, it is the depth of, what I think many of us might say is the depths of nihilism. I mean, it means rehabilitating Hitler and Stalin. It means rehabilitating the two of them together. It means rehabilitating the end of the European order. It means rehabilitating the beginning of the Second World War, and presenting all of this as neutral and the rest of this as abnormal is to shift the whole term, or is to attempt to shift the whole framework, the whole ground on which we talk about the European present and the European future. But the contradiction with which this is presented, the contradictions which are exported, both the historical contradiction and the contradiction in the way that this is all pitched to Europe, I think raise a more interesting question, and perhaps a final question. And here's where this all melds into the way that many of us actually see the world or talk about the world. If everything is contradictory, even if one doesn't accept that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact is a good thing, what if one accepts that these contradictions are inevitable? What if one accepts that that everything should be doubted, that nothing is really certain, that everything is equal? What if one accepts, as Herling Grudzinski's interrogator said, that in the end, it all comes to the same thing, right? In the end, it all comes to the same thing. Everything's relative. Nothing can really be sure. Even if one isn't convinced by the rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, what if the attempt is part of a larger package of contradictions, which makes it hard for us to feel certain about any of our judgments? And what if one of our problems already before any of this started was our uncertainty about all of our judgments? What if this moves us in a certain direction, being unsure about, let's call it, see, I told you this was going to be my conservative moment, let's call it truth, right? Let's just say this moves us away from being able to accept something like existential truth, where Ukrainians go onto the Maidan because of who they are, because of who they decided to be, as opposed to because they were part of some geostrategic plan. What if this moves us to a world where we have trouble accepting the truth of social trust, where you and I can join organizations together or have a conversation together because we accept that we're all acting in good faith and they're not part of some kind of larger worldwide conspiracy, right? I'm happy to admit that the IWM is a world conspiracy, by the way, but you're not all part of that world conspiracy, and we're still doing something together. What if this means that we are pushed further away from the idea of a legal truth, right? For example, in which there are states and that there are laws about states. And what if this moves us away still further from an idea that there is a historical truth? Because historical truth, as debatable as it is and must by its nature be, is an assumption that one needs to draw lessons from history. And if one can't draw lessons from history, then it's very hard to imagine how you can have a Europe. Because as debatable and as questionable as many of the historical arguments that Europeans make are, it is unquestionable that the European Union as an entity depends upon a certain stance towards the past, if this drives us away from the belief that you can actually draw lessons from the past, then the chance of there being a European future is probably diminished. That's the thought I'll leave you with. Thank you very much.